primary attachment figure. So the mother, usually the mother. Sometimes it's the father, but usually the mother. Fathers, with their playful tactile stimulation, they become really important when children become mobile. When children start to crawl and toddle, when they're around 18 months to 2 years old, fathers become incredibly exciting. And they're really important. So when fathers aren't around in those days, when children are starting to explore the world, those children have a harder time separating from mothers. So it's really important to have what we say, the yin and the yang. What we're doing now is we are not prioritizing attachment security, which is the foundation for then healthy separation. And when healthy separation starts, fathers are critical. When you have another child, a second child, fathers are critical because fathers seduce the older child. They say, come on, let's go out and play. Let's go kick the soccer ball. Let's go to the swing set. And they give a space to the mother with the next baby. They help the older children to grow up.
Earlier on, you mentioned a study that I read about when I was studying psychology once upon a time, which is the rhesus monkeys study with the wire mother. For anybody that's never heard about that study, I think it's quite important to understand the profound impact that touch and
well, that was an attachment study.
Yeah, what was it? What's touch called in the science world?
Skin to skin.
Skin to skin. Can you give me an overview of that study and what it showed for people that aren't aware of it?
Well, they took these baby rhesus monkeys and they let some be with the mothers, and the mothers nurtured those babies, and those babies became healthily attached and secure, and those were the healthy, emotionally healthy babies. Then they gave another subset of monkeys a wire mother covered with a piece of cloth or fur or something. And those babies became very neurotic, but at least they were clinging. They became like the ambivalent attachment babies because there was no response from the mother, but at least they were holding on to this mother. And then they gave, and these babies became very neurotic, and then they gave the subset of babies nothing. And those babies literally lost their minds. And I mean, there are other studies which are more recent than that. That's quite an old study. There is a researcher named Michael Meany. He did a study on licking and grooming. Animals who lick and groom their young, meaning are nurturing, skin to skin, lick and groom. In human terms, that would be holding, touching, loving, skin to skin. Those, if a mother licked and groomed her young, that baby would become more resilient to stress in the future. The babies who were not licked and groomed by their mothers became less resilient to stress in the future. In addition, the babies who were more resilient to stress because their mothers had licked and groomed them passed down generationally the ability to lick and groom the next generation. What happened to the babies who weren't licked and groomed? Guess what happened?
They didn't pass it down.
Right. And that's what's happening to humans today. If we don't lick and groom our babies, I mean, take it for whatever. If we don't lick and groom our babies, we don't pass on this resilience to stress and adversity, but we also don't pass on the desire to lick and groom to have babies.
Your story, going back to your story, which we were talking about, are there any areas of privilege that you need to acknowledge that someone else listening to this now goes, yeah, but that's all right for you? Because, maybe someone who didn't have a partner there, or someone who is in a difficult economic situation, extremely difficult economic situation, living in the projects in Harlem or something. I'm saying this because...
Well, it's not the mothers in the projects in Harlem, because I'll tell you, the mothers in the projects in Harlem stay home with their babies. That's what's interesting. Very poor people in America. So let me just say, I love America. America sucks. And I'll tell you why America sucks from my perspective. And I say this internationally. I go around the world saying America sucks, and I'm going to tell you why. We are the only country in the world other than Papua New Guinea who does not have a paid parental maternity leave. We do not have paid maternity leave. Nobody cares about children. They care about the GDP and the bottom line, and the people who are out there talking about this stuff are economists saying women have to work for the economy. Nobody cares about children, because if we cared about children, our tax money would be in paid leave, not for 3 months, not for 6 months, for at least a year. In Hungary, they have 3 years. Slovenia, Slovakia, Estonia has 3 years. Hungary, I think, has 2 years of paid leave. Sweden, I have some issues with Sweden, but Sweden has 14 months. Sweden, after 14 months, makes women go back to work full time and put them in institutional care, and all those babies are breaking down. So 14 months isn't even enough. But if we could even get to a civilized place of 1 year of paid leave in this country, and then the next 2 years, some way that parents could be complemented so they could work part-time, supplemented so they could work part-time. I'm a reasonable, realistic person. I know this country is never going to go for 3 years of paid leave, even though I would love them to. I also know that this country isn't going to go for an entitlement called paid leave, because that's the kind of country we are. We talk a big game, but we don't want to put our money where our mouth is. There is the possibility, now that the Republicans are in, of a creative solution, which is potentially using things like Social Security in advance, borrowing from your Social Security. So I'm a mom, and I say, to stay home, I can borrow from my Social Security for a year and then work a year or two longer in my life. Wouldn't you say that most women who wanted to stay home with their babies would say, I'll work longer so I can stay home with my baby? There are ways to creatively deal with it. From my perspective, this is what's going on. People on the left will not compromise. They'll only do an entitlement called paid leave, but they only are asking for it for 3 to 6 months. After that, they want women back in the workforce and institutional daycare. So I'm not on the left. People on the right talk a lot about family. They're the party of the family now. But they do not want tax dollars to go into paid leave. They don't like the entitlements that already exist, and they don't want to add any more. And so the only way they're going to give it to women and men is if they put skin in the game. Mm-hmm. This is the country we live in. Again, I'm a realist. I think in any way that we can give families the choice to care for their own children, particularly in the early years, we will create a population of healthier children.
How do we know that more paid leave equals better children, less strain on the healthcare system in terms of mental health, mortality, whatever it might be? How do you make a statistical or a science or research-backed case that if we had 3 years of paid leave in the United States or in the UK or Australia, Canada, wherever, that it would be a net positive for society outside of it just being an opinion?
Well, the research shows, the longitudinal attachment research shows that children who are insecurely attached at 12 months of age, 20 years later, are insecurely, 80% of them are insecurely attached and suffer from mental disorders. That's what the longitudinal attachment research says. So we now have decades of basically children were followed from when they were infants. And the ones who were securely attached 20 years later are still securely attached and doing great. And the ones who were insecurely attached, most still insecurely attached. And it's tied and correlated to all of these mental illness conditions, right? So there's a lot of research to show what attachment security does for children in the long run. So, you're asking a question about, I suppose you could take your paid leave and go play soccer in the park and go play tennis and I don't know, like play cards with your friend. How can I say how people are going to use their paid leave? But if your paid leave is being used to be home with your child, then it's going to benefit your child.
So many of the guests that I speak to on this podcast, especially those that become incredibly successful, athletes, entrepreneurs, whoever, they often have some form of neglect in their past. Richard Williams, Serena and Venus Williams' father, he was very intense with them from a very young age, and he's raised two of the greatest tennis players in history. Joe Jackson was strict and often controversial with Michael, who went on to become the king of pop. Earl Woods, who was Tiger Woods' father, was very intense in his coaching and mentoring style, which led him to become great. And obviously Beyonce is the other example I gave, who Matthew and Tina, who were parents to Beyonce, managed Destiny's Child and Beyonce's solo career, meticulously shaping them into a global superstar. So parents think, I want to raise kids that are superstars. I want my kids to be great.
Okay, so I'm going to say right now, I don't recommend that as a professional.
Okay.
I'm just saying. So I can't comment on a lot of those people because I could get in a lot of trouble for commenting on a lot of those people.
Sure.
But I will say that amongst those people, there is controversy, meaning at least one of those parents, and I don't know the history of the others, was abusive. And so you could say that narcissism is abusive to children. When we project our needs and desires and likes and who we are onto our children, we're not letting them authentically be themselves. The greatest gift you can give your child is to see your child as an authentic individual who is an individual and themselves, and not to see them as a mini-me. When you start architecting their life, there's a good chance you're going to lose that child emotionally at some point. They're either going to hate you, they may be successful in their careers, they may have terrible personal lives, they may be narcissistic parents themselves. So I don't recommend that school of thought. What I do recommend is if your child shows promise in something that they also seem to love and have a drive to be good at, then you can support that drive. Just make sure to keep yourself in check along the way to make sure that they are driving it, not you.
Health is a huge focus for me in 2025, and I'm not just talking about eating right and exercising, I'm talking about my recovery too. I'm halfway through 60 workouts in 60 days, and to help my body recover, I've been using a health gadget that I've shared with you before. They're a sponsor of this podcast, and their product has such a huge impact on my recovery. I'm referring to my Bon Charge infrared sauna blanket. These are similar to the infrared saunas that you see in gyms and spas, but the big difference is that it's portable. I started the year off at my home in South Africa, so I brought the blanket with me and I used it most nights before bed when I was training hard. And it helped me relax, it helped my muscles feel less sore, and I wake up feeling more recovered. It works by heating up your body directly rather than just the air around you to improve circulation and reduce stiffness. I've also noticed that it's had a big impact on my skin as well. And thankfully, Bon Charge has offered me 25% off for my listeners. So if you use code DIARY at checkout, you'll also get free shipping and a year-long warranty. Head to boncharge.com/diary. ADHD.
Yeah, okay.
I don't feel like I don't even have to ask a question here, but just to set the stage, the reason why I'm so compelled by this is just this, I have to say it, a shocking rise in diagnosis and prescriptions over the last 10 years. Between 2000 and 2018, ADHD diagnoses in the UK rose approximately 20-fold.
Yes.
Among boys aged 10 to 16, diagnosis increased from 1% roughly to about 3.5% in 2018. And in men aged 18 to 29, there was a nearly 50-fold increase in ADHD prescriptions during the same period. And the same applies to the United States, where an estimated 15.5 million adults in the US have been diagnosed with ADHD. Approximately 1 in 9 US children have been diagnosed with ADHD at some point, with 10.5% having a current diagnosis. I don't know where ADHD was, but the conversation around it, the prescriptions, the diagnosis seemed to have really surged into culture in a really, really big way. What's going on?
So ADHD was one of the factors that drove me to write Being There, because I was seeing this huge uptick in ADHD diagnosis and children being medicated so early. Do you know what the fight or flight reaction is?
That's when the sympathetic nervous system starts to kick into action. And
yes, so well, it's basically our evolutionary response to predatory threat. So if a saber-toothed tiger was chasing you, you either stood and fight, or you ran for your life, flight. So when our children are under stress, they go into fight or flight. So one of the first signs that a child is under stress that they cannot manage is when they become aggressive in school. They hit, they bite, they throw chairs, they have trouble, socially in daycare or preschool or even in school. Or they become distracted, which is the flight part of fight or flight. So what's happening is their nervous systems, the stress regulating part of their brain is getting turned on. So we say that the stress regulating part of their brain has to do with a little almond-shaped part of the brain called the amygdala. It's a very primitive part of the brain, very old part of the brain. And it regulates stress throughout our lives. It helps us to manage it. What we know is that part of the brain is supposed to remain offline for the first year to 3 years, which is why mothers wear babies on their bodies. It's why babies stay close to their mothers in the first 3 years, to keep the amygdala quiet and only incrementally expose children to stress and frustration that they can manage. So imagine taking small bites of it so you can digest it, right? And your mother's there to help you digest the stress. What we're doing now by separating mothers and babies, by putting babies into daycare with strangers, is by sleep training babies, all these weird things that we're doing to babies, is we're turning the amygdala on. We're making it active precociously, too early. What happens when the amygdala is activated too early is it becomes very active and very large very quickly. The problem is then it shrivels up and burns out also because it cannot manage that kind of stress so early. When it ceases to be functional, it ceases to be functional for a lifetime. And so it's very important to protect, what's the expression? The family jewels. These are the family jewels in the brain of a baby. This is the jewel, the amygdala. You want to keep the stress to an absolute minimum in the first year, which is why sleep training is dangerous. It's why letting babies cry it out. It's why putting babies into daycare. It's why leaving babies for hours on end when they're so very fragile is so bad for their brains, because it gets the cortisol flowing, which is the stress hormone, but it makes this part of the brain very active. So it grows, and then and ceases to be functional in the future, like a PTSD response. So what we know is that these children are in hyper-vigilant states of stress. ADHD children, hyper-vigilant states of stress. If you stay in a hyper-vigilant state of stress long enough, you go into a hypo-vigilant state of stress, which then causes depression. So what we have now are not disorders. So there was a whole movement to take the D off of ADHD because it's not a disorder. It is a stress response. And instead of asking the right questions, which are, okay, what's causing the stress? How do we make sure that our children are not exposed to this kind of stress because they're going into fight or flight? So the nervous system, as you said, the brain has an on switch and an off switch. The on switch to stress is the amygdala, the hippocampus is the off switch. And you'd say the stress response is in a negative feedback loop. It's actually important. Like, in other words, if a saber-toothed tiger is chasing you, very important that you can activate, right? And run or fight. So the stress response is supposed to be short-term. It's supposed to be acute rather than chronic. So we can kind of manifest it. We can activate it. But then it's supposed to be turned off by the turn-off switch, the hippocampus. What we're seeing in children's brains is that the amygdala is growing very precociously large, and the hippocampus, which is the off switch, is very small. So we have this problem. As we say, Houston, we have a problem. We have an on switch going full speed, gas, no brakes, and no off switch. And that's causing ADHD, behavioral problems that are hugely rising in children in school, a lot of aggression and violence. And so that's what's happening. This is a stress response. And again, instead of asking the right questions like, Where is this coming from? What's causing the stress? Instead, we silence the children's pain. We tell parents, we'll medicate it and we'll just relieve the symptoms. For me, that's malpractice. The way we treat ADHD is malpractice.